Is the United States vulnerable to an attack given our attacks on Iran? We've been bombing them. We've been hitting their military infrastructure quite hard. We have used a lot of our munitions. How much does that put us on the back burner should we be attacked? Should one of our allied friendly neighbors get attacked? Say, if Taiwan is ultimately invaded by China, do we have the ability and go and stand up for them? Also, do we have the ability to ready ourselves with arms should this war spiral out of control? Should a new one pop up? That's why I'm getting into a conversation with John Ferrari, retired Major General with the U.S. Army. He's also a non-resident scholar with the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. They're a public policy think tank that have been around for, wow, I think at least 80 years, if not more. They promote themselves as being pro-free enterprise, advocating for limited government through research, education. Also, what does it mean to win a war? Is the public perception of who wins a war different based on whether America goes into Iran and gets rid of their enriched uranium to prevent them from developing a nuclear weapon? Is it opening the Strait of Hormuz? Is it establishing new leadership? Who says you win? When do you win a war? John's perspective is that it comes down to three different factors. He's going to let you know what they are and how he believes Iran only needs to achieve one of those three in order to quote-unquote win from their perspective, and he believes America needs to hit all three. What does this mean for America's ability to help and possibly continue to equip Ukraine, defend ourselves on the Pacific, Atlantic, our hard infrastructure on land and sea, troops at home and abroad? Plenty of questions to dive into about what this moment and this war with Iran means in America's ability to take care of herself. John Ferrari is delving into what we don't already know. I didn't already know about how the United States military equips itself, what kind of weapons are developed, if there are weapons we should be developing that are cheaper and more effective, i.e. some of these smaller drones that have the ability, at least in Ukraine, to take out Russian planes. Is that something that the Pentagon should be prioritizing? What he would advise leaders right now to ensure that America is achieving their own goals? Is there more money that needs to be spent in the U.S. military? But what happens behind the scenes before a strike is ordered, once it's airborne, once it's on the ground, and how we have our own ability to make sure that we can still defend ourselves in war? It's the reality we're facing right now. We're in the middle of one. So with that, let's delve into my conversation with John. Some great insight. I came away smarter about the issue than going in. That's my goal here, for us to get beyond the headlines and explain why they matter, and for regular people to get inside scoops, inside knowledge. Let's do it. And joining me now is John Ferrari, retired Major General with the U.S. Army, non-resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. John, I really wanted to dive into what the heck is going on in the Middle East and why it matters to everyday people in our everyday lives, and peel back the curtain. We spend so much money with our defense budget, more than, I believe, several countries combined. So let's start from a 50,000-foot perspective. Once a strike is authorized, where do the weapons actually come from? Are they sitting ready to go? Or are they pulled in from stockpiles elsewhere? What happens behind the scenes?
Yeah, so I think it's important to even take a step back from that and realize there are two key inflection points that got us to where we are today. So the first, you got to go back to 1979, where the United States and Iran have really been in conflict with each other since then. So this war that's a hot war now has really been going on for decades at a time. The second key point is in the early 1990s after the Gulf War, right? So the Soviet Union had collapsed, the U.S. was disarming, it wanted a peace dividend, and it made a strategic decision that wars in the future were going to be short, they were going to be violent, shock and awe, and that we were going to rely on exquisite weapons to do the bidding of the United States. And so if you fast forward from that, right, you get to the point now where the President of the United States authorized military action against Iran, and it was violent and quick, but as we saw, we started running short of some of the more exquisite munitions that we have. The U.S. military is very, very, very good at actually getting equipment and munitions to the war zone that it has in its stockpiles. But the stockpiles are low because they've only been planning for a short war.
Hmm. Do you think the Pentagon should have stocked up more, considering that Iraq and Afghanistan lasted much longer than we had anticipated too? In this case, if this prolongs, should it have been something that we had spent even more money on having our stockpile built up?
Yeah, so I think there's two key points, and the answer is yes, right? So the first key point is that the warning signs have been blinking red for a long time. So during the 1990s, when Saddam Hussein and we were doing Southern Watch, the Air Force was running out of munitions quickly in that fight. Then what happened during, you said, Iraq and Afghanistan, the Army was running short of small arms, right? So we knew that our stockpiles weren't big enough. In 2012, when sequestration hit, the national defense strategy was put out, and there was a counterpoint put out that said, hey, I think we're going in the wrong direction. Right? Wars are long, they're violent, and that having fewer weapons is not as good as having a lot. So what we found also in the around 2016, as we were doing the attacks in Syria and ISIS, we were running short of these precision munitions. So policymakers have ignored this problem in a bipartisan fashion for many years, mainly because two reasons. One, it costs money to fix, but number two, it was going against the prevailing way that America and policymakers and the political leadership that run the department want to fight wars, right? Bloodless, from afar, precision. We'll get them to surrender right away. We don't have to fight a long, dirty war.
That
There's
sounds like a
also
privileged perspective. Am I wrong here? Because certainly somebody's motivation in defending their own country, say it's Iran, is different from America's motivation for getting involved.
So you're absolutely right. But it's the difference between the war being an existential threat, if you're Iran or Iraq or any of the other places we've been, Kosovo, versus for us, it's a war of our choosing. It's not existential. And so they will fight and fight and fight and fight. We just want it done. And there's a saying in warfare that, right, the enemy gets a vote, and we forget about that.
So if we are lower in our stockpile than we think we should be to prepare for a longer conflict, what does this do in our ability to defend ourselves here on home turf, but also troops and American citizens abroad, but also, say, Taiwan? If China is drooling right now and they want to go and launch their own campaign, in addition to what's going on in Ukraine, is Ukraine and Taiwan a lot more vulnerable right now because of our stockpile?
So, great question. I think there's a couple of ways to think through it. So the first is, yes, we are living on borrowed time. When you use the munitions at the rates we use them in Iran, and you don't replenish them, and you can't replenish them because the production lines don't exist, right? Everybody knows how many munitions you bought. It's a matter of public record every year in the budget.
Are you primarily talking about Tomahawk cruise missiles here, some of the hardest things,
So
bunker busters?
Tomahawks, THAADs, Patriots, SM-3s. For a while there, if you remember the Ukraine war, we were short artillery rounds, right? So it's dumb munitions and smart munitions, right? All of it is in short supply, depending upon what you happen to be using at that time and need. The problem, it's like squeezing on a balloon. It's small arms in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's artillery munitions in Ukraine, and it's these expensive weapons with Iran, but it all points to the same problem, that none of our production lines meet the needs that we currently have.
I saw a headline within the last week, and you might have seen it too, that the U.S. government was considering asking, I believe, vehicle manufacturers and jumping in and trying to streamline the process to fulfill some of our stockpiles. What does that look like realistically?
So I think, the exquisite weapons that we design and build, the ones we talked about, the THAADs, the PAC-3s, the Tomahawks, those are like hand-built, exquisite sports cars that cost, $700,000. They're handmade in a factory. They're made in low quantities. Those always, and what's important about those is they all need very, very specialized equipment that no auto manufacturer has or doesn't have. So those can only go to the people who make them now. There's no other way around it. Now, what can the auto manufacturers do, or other manufacturers, right? This is where the United States has a choice to make. We can keep buying and building these exquisite, expensive, hard to build munitions, or we can build a lot of cheaper, less expensive, but easy to produce munitions that you can produce in quantity. So think about drones, right? So there really is no existing production line, but if you design the drone to be made with commercial machinery, now you can have all these companies, right, make them. In World War II, we did this.
Yes.
So we went from cars to aircraft. But what the department did at that point was it went and looked at the factory, it saw the machinery it had, and it designed the aircraft to the machinery that was on hand. We don't do that today. We kind of say, well, this is what we want. Now go figure out how to make it. So we've taken an exactly 180-degree approach to arming ourselves.
Is that to our detriment? Would you rather see an all hands on deck call, make us what you can, instead of we need this very specific way of building some of these munitions, as you put it?
Well, yes, because so remember when you're fighting somebody, right, you have to have bullets, right? And if you run out or they think you're going to run out, then they're like, okay, I'll just wait. You're like, keep bombing me because eventually you're going to run out. And so what you wind up doing counterintuitively, remember, war is a violent action. And the purpose of war is to break the will of your opponent. They have to believe that there's no way they can win. They must be physically and mentally exhausted and give up the will to fight. But if I know you can only hit me 3 or 4 more times, right? It's like, I can withstand that. But if I knew the beatings were going to continue forever, right, then you would make a different decision.
Let me ask you about that. How does a country like Iran know how many missiles America has on hand?
So it's all public knowledge because every year the United States government, the department has to go to the Congress and say, I'm going to buy 40 missiles. We're replacing these. This is how many on hand. So those, it's all, plus or minus, right?
Can we actually trust that?
Yeah, right. Again, because it's not like we've been making these missiles secretly. So it's all right. We live in a democracy. This is all a matter of public record, and right, all those are known.
So you're saying, for any skeptics out there are no secret weapons manufacturing programs that have not been given congressionally approved dollars and cents.
Yeah, well, everything's got congressionally approved dollars. There are secret programs, but nothing that will kind of bend the needle on these things, right? Again, there could be exquisite things that are out there, but nothing that's gonna impact any of these decisions. There's not a secret stockpile of ultimate, different weapons.
If the Pentagon is looking for manufacturers to build very specific tailor-made munitions, as I had said earlier, casting a wide net, send us what you can. What's the timeline here to actually replenishing what we've been using?
So we had a saying in the Pentagon, from when you shot a missile to when you got the next one was 3 years. And that was assuming you shot what the production line can handle. And we've shot way beyond the production line. So the Deputy Secretary of War has been working with the munition manufacturers on a 7-year plan to triple production. But it's going to take time, right? So, the first missile you fire may take 3 years. Right, but if you fire 100 of them at once, that 100th, right, may take 4 or 5 years. So I think, to replace the full stockpile is probably going to take on the order of 5 to 6 years. And that just puts you back where you started from.
Easy math, longer than what you had said during your time in the Pentagon, 3 years. What kind of vulnerabilities does our existing stockpiles provide to us? What are our current Achilles heels, if you will, given what we have and the timeline it's going to take to replenish our stockpile? What are some scenarios?
Well, so the Achilles heel is, right, if shock and awe doesn't work, we don't have a set punch, right? And the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, right, they all know that, right? It's, can I outlast the United States? And you never want to put a president, and we do, in the position of like, okay, you get 1 shot, maybe 2, and then after that, we're out of bullets. And so I think what needs to happen, right, is we need the strategy of relying on these exquisite weapons is the original sin, right? And so what we see in Ukraine, what we see going on with the Iranians is having a lot of cheap munitions can cause as much havoc as several exquisite ones. And so
We're
we
talking
need
these
to move
drones,
to,
right?
well,
The
but
tiny
what's a
ones.
missile, right? A missile is a drone. It's just an expensive drone. A
Fair.
drone is something that flies, right? So drones are just weapons that are cheaply made and, go one way and then they explode. It's an artillery, right? What makes a drone is its ability to steer, and it's got advanced intelligence in it. But a tomahawk is just a drone, right? When you think about it.
Well, let me ask this from a financial perspective. What the successes that Ukraine has had blowing up entire airplanes with these drones that cost pennies on the dollar relative to the other types of airborne missiles, munitions, etc. Do you think we've solved our problem? If we ultimately say, whoa, it's going to take 5 to 6 years to build some of the best tomahawks or some other hard hitting missiles, if a cheap drone can do the same thing in
Well, we
a lot
haven't
less
solved
amount
the
of time.
problem. We know what the solution is, but we don't have a manufacturing capacity to build that many drones, right? The Ukrainians, it's interesting, right? They're letting their units buy it from people who make it in their garages. So they're not even going to the auto shop. They're people are manufacturing it in their garages, right? And wives and the society is arming them. We're not there yet, right? We're not. We could not produce 2 million drones this year, right? But the Ukrainians are going to produce 4 or 5 million drones. So we have to make a decision to pivot in that direction, and that's then where some of these commercial manufacturers come into play.
From what I'm hearing from you, correct me if I'm wrong, the consensus, uh, or at least from you, your perspective is we're underspending on munitions. But on the flip side, I'll ask, is there any area where you think we're overspending in defense funding?
Yes. So I think we're overspending on these exquisite weapons. So, for example, the Joint Strike Fighter is a great example of a plane that's going to cost us between sustainment and production, between $1 and $2 trillion over its lifetime. You can buy, if you cut that production in half, you can fund all of these cheap munitions, right? Navy shipbuilding, right? We're building a lot of really expensive 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, $15 billion ships when we could be building a lot more drones. So we're still investing money in these really exquisite, hard to produce weapon systems that could otherwise be used to produce attritable mass vehicles such as drones. One-way track drone is just a missile.
Who would make that decision, and how long would it take to change the manufacturing game plan?
Well, that decision rests jointly with the administration. So the Pentagon would have to decide it wants to do it, and then it would have to get with the Congress. What I would say is, because the Congress appropriates money and approves those things. What I would say is, right, my belief is the Congress is kind of understands that math and is waiting for the Pentagon to kind of get moving on this stuff. Now, in fairness, the Army has been doing that. It's doing a request for proposals for drones. I'd say they've been the most, under Secretary Driscoll, been the most forward-leaning. They've cut back on the number of helicopters they're buying, right? Apaches. They're getting rid of Apache units and investing in aerial drones. I would say the Navy is the most reluctant, the least forward-leaning in this,
Why
and
is
then
that?
the Air Force is somewhere in between.
How would you explain the latter 2 points, the Navy and the Air Force?
So the Army fundamentally is a structure of, right, the Army equips people, and its fundamental culture is people are the warfighter, and whatever equipment they need, that's what we need to get. So it's not wedded to its equipment. The Air Force and the Navy, they man their equipment. And so the equipment is what they are, right? So the notion of the Navy saying, hey, I'm going to get rid of a bunch of these ships and we're going to go unmanned, there's like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, right? That's hard for them culturally to do. The same thing with the Air Force to say, look, we're going to cut the fighters back to get drones, right? Their entire culture is built around that. And so that's a fundamental difference between the land-based services that are people-based and the air and sea services, which are equipment-based.
How much of war planning today, in your mind, is driven not by strategy, but by what's available, and vice versa?
Well, so you can't fight a war with what's not available, right? So by the nature of the question, right? If you're going to fight somebody, you have to ask yourself, what do you have and how can you do it, right? There's no way around that. And we see the Iranians doing that. We see the Ukrainians doing that. We see the United States and CENTCOM doing that. Like, you can't make something from something you don't. So even like the blockade that's going on and the closing of the straits, it's like, well, okay, like you only got what you got, so figure out how to make it happen.
Well, let me ask you this. The Strait of Hormuz, do you think that is Iran's biggest tool in their war chest right now in order to make sure that their interests are kept alive and not necessarily weapons itself?
Well, so it's their biggest source of leverage, but only because they have drones that can hit the ships in there, and they have these fast boats that can go out there and lay mines and attack the ships, right? If they didn't have weapons, then they wouldn't actually control. Like, you can only control the straits if you have weapons, right? So somebody's got to fear that you're going to do violence unto them. And so because the straits are so narrow, right? The weapons the Iranians have are small in quantity, hard to stop because you can't see them coming, and that's what gives Iran the leverage over the straits.
You may have just answered my next question, and that is, how do you think Iran is achieving their goals right now, objectively? And separately, how do you think the United States is effectively fighting here?
So what I would say is it's way too early to tell on either side, right? So it depends upon the time you use to measure. So one could say that, like, look, Iran's only thing it had to do was withstand being punched a couple of times for a couple of weeks, and so long as it remained standing, it won. Right? That's one way to think about this, right? And they have done that. They took the hits and they're still standing. But I think they realize now the price they paid for that economically is going to be huge. When you listen, and it's hard to get full readings because, right, they've cut off the internet, but most of their production capacity has been taken offline and destroyed. Their internet, they took down their internet, so people aren't getting paid, right? It was a relatively sophisticated economy. And so businesses are shutting down. The supply chain has shut down. People don't have money, right? And so the question is, so how do they survive this? And the answer is, well, they can't, right? So in one ways, the United States has kind of come out on the short end of the near-term effects of the war, but the Iranians are on the short end of the stick going forward, and they need a deal. And I think that's kind of the issue here is like, who can withstand, can the United States stay in the game long enough to force the Iranians to need the deal, or can the Iranians make this thing painful enough in the short term that the United States policymakers buckle? And that's the discussions going on right now. The Iranians need money.
What do you think the United States can do now to further leverage whatever's left of the Iranian leadership to come to the table?
What I'll say is that in the near term, right, the Iranians, right, the problems the Iranians have is they have trouble internally coordinating and talking, and there's nobody actually understands who's making the decisions. And so I think you have some of the leaders who are like, okay, we need to cut a deal and do something. And you got others who are like, no way. And so even if they cut a deal, if they can't control the IRGC and they still continue to close the straits, right? Who's got decision-making authority? Who are you negotiating with, and can they deliver? That's the part nobody actually knows at this point. That's the problem when you take out so many leaders, right? Those who are left, right? Everybody thinks they're in charge of their piece.
So, who, in all likelihood, is the State Department and the White House talking to in the Iranian leadership?
Well, we know they're talking to the foreign minister, right? And the head of the parliament, right? Those are the people who came to Pakistan, right? And likely will come again. But we also know that the Republican Guard, which is the regime's military, not their army, right? Their army is a different institution. The Republican Guard are the ones who have been sowing terrorism around the Middle East and around the globe. They're not willing at this moment to capitulate. They're like, hit us some more, right? So that's the point, is until the Iranians or, the United States can help them sort through that, in order for there to be peace, both sides have to, right? All parties in Iran have to agree.
So who do you think has the upper hand in Iran? Is it the Guard or is it the Iranian leadership in the army?
So it's the people with the weapons, and in this case, it's the Republican Guard, because they were set up to make sure that the army doesn't get out of control, right? So they are the police state of the state, and whoever controls that controls the state. So the army is subservient, and so the Republican Guard is ultimately the one who are going to decide whether there's peace or war.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions about U.S. military preparedness?
So I think one of the misconceptions is that the military has unlimited capacity to do anything. And we've seen that now over and over again, that the men and women are impressively trained. Like, the level of training and the ability, the command and control to operate and conduct raids anywhere in the world is unprecedented in all of human history. It is the most capable military the world has ever seen. It's quite impressive at what the military can do. The problem is the staying power, right? Because, again, coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of people believed that we should never get involved in a long war again. And one way to do that is to make sure you don't have the forces or the munitions to do it. And that is just a short-sighted trade that has been made, which is we will deliberately keep the military from having enough weapons, right? So that, or soldiers or munitions, so that we can't get into another long war again. And that's just not a good position to be in.
Does that blame come down to one person, a handful of people, systemic? How do you see it?
30 years of decision making by everybody, right? Because, right, nobody wanted to pay the bill needed to keep it. And it's the siren song. It's kind of like a Greek tragedy, which is like, well, you can win the wars, right, on the cheap. Right? You only need this much, and you can go in and nobody actually gets hurt, and you can do it from standoff, and war is bloodless, and, right, you do it for a short period of time, and look, you can win. Well, okay, maybe, but as we're seeing, maybe not.
How dependent is the United States on foreign suppliers for weapons? And given the tensions with the White House and other allied countries where we may be getting some of these weapons or material for these weapons to assemble from, how much of a risk does that geopolitical fighting have in our ability to actually build back our stockpile?
The problem is not dependence on our allies for weapons. The problem is we depend on our adversaries for weapons. So all of our exquisite weapons rely on rare earth materials. And the rare earths are not rare, they're just rare and right. It's just messy to dig up and messy to make. And we've outsourced that as a nation to China. And so the Chinese control all of the rare earths that go into these weapons. And right now they've said, like, hey, you can't use these in your weapons. Have a nice day. And so we're drawing down stockpiles. But if they were to shut down rare earths, we couldn't actually manufacture the weapons.
Even the cheaper, smaller, faster to make drones?
So, it's interesting. Rare earth minerals. So the Ukrainians have managed to now produce drones that don't rely on anything from China. We are not there yet, because even things like magnets rely on rare earths to make them. And so you couldn't manufacture a car without rare earths, never mind weapons.
How did Ukraine get so quickly to that point? And
Well, it wasn't
unable.
quickly. It was 4 years of being pummeled by the Russians, being held hostage by the international community. And if they didn't get there and didn't get it done, they would cease to exist and they would be slaughtered. And so it turns out, again, if you think you're about to get slaughtered, your mind gets focused and you figure out how to develop these things without that. Now, they're doing it at scale for Ukraine. Like, we're 100x bigger, and so it's a lot harder, and we don't feel that pressure. Now, in fairness to the administration, they're making investments in companies all over the world, in Australia and Nevada. So the Department of War is taking equity positions in rare earth mineral mining and production. But it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years before those things get developed. But at least now we're doing something about it.
What role do private defense contractors play in a moment like this?
Well, most all of the military's defense production is private, right? The government has a couple of arsenals and a couple of depots and a couple of plants that fix things, but overwhelmingly 80 to 90% is all private sector. So the private sector plays 100% of the really of the production. The big question is, what role does the private sector play in the development of weapons? And there you're seeing a shift. So from the 90s forward, the department contracted with the private firms, but to do the development at the behest of the Pentagon. You're seeing companies like Anduril and Shield AI and Palantir saying, no, we know what you need, we'll develop it, and then we'll sell it to you. So you see this inversion of development relying more and more on the private sector. And in many ways, right, the information technology side, right, Silicon Valley, AI, all of that, which is really, a core competency of the United States private sector. But for a long time, Google wouldn't work for the Department of War. Under Project Maven, it backed out. It said, we don't help the warfighters of the United States. Well, now that's all shifting and changing. And so that part of the American industrial might is now coming to work with and help the department and its warfighters.
Other than missiles, bullets, diplomacy, threats, sanctions, trade, etc., are there any other physical ways that the United States can attack Iran's infrastructure or whatever it holds valuable? Is there an ability to go after their grid, etc.?
Yeah, so cyber war is already going on, right? Both sides are fighting that battle. We saw it in Ukraine, we see it in Syria, we see it all over, right? The electromagnetic spectrum and also computers, right? Viruses, right? So that part of the war is being fought in the shadows right now. But make no mistakes, it is being fought. On the softer side is the information operations. So the Iranians have a very, very well-oiled global machine to pass out information, and the United States does not. And so in many ways...
Are you talking like spies at this point?
No, this is all public diplomacy, right? So if you go to Europe, right, the Iranians are pumping out information into the European newsphere more so than the United States is. And so we just lack the mechanisms and the desire to do what they call public diplomacy. But the Iranians are very, very good at it.
Historically, do you see bigger success with one-off strikes or pummeling campaigns like we're seeing now?
So you have to, in the history of warfare, right, it depends on what you want to accomplish, but you never really defeat your enemy from the air. If you want to defeat them, you have to come at them from the ground. There's really no documented history, and they've been talking about this for 100 years. If we just drop enough bombs, they'll surrender. War doesn't work like that. The only time it worked was with the atom bomb in Japan, and we're not going to go there. So everywhere else, you need a ground force, right? Because you can only do so much. Now, if you're just what people have been calling mowing the lawn, right? You just want to go out and destroy some capacity, slow them down, right? Okay, right? But that's not that buys you time, and that is a strategy. But that is not. That's one of the reasons these wars go on forever, is because we never want to do what needs to be done to actually end it.
Realistically, do you think the U.S. is going to come out on top of this? If so, what that format looks like and a timeline here? I mean, there are a number of variables sticking their necks out there.
Well, there are three ways you measure out on top. There's militarily, right? There's strategically, and then there's public opinion. So the United States needs to win all three to come out on top. The Iranians only need one of the three to come out on top, right? So I think militarily, the United States, that's not a problem. Politically, what are the strategic war aims? And how do they come up with that, right? Do they keep the uranium? Don't they keep it? Do the straits open? Don't they open? Do they repress their people? Do they still support Hezbollah and Hamas? Don't they support them? right? And then there's public opinion, which is like, who do people think won? And in many respects, that's the Iranian strongest hand. Again, they're much as overpowering we are in the military domain. They are that powerful in the public information campaign. So now, right, it's who negotiates the better deal strategically and accomplishes their strategic war aims. And that remains to be seen.
Talk about war typically won on the ground versus via airstrikes. There's chatter, skepticism if President Trump is going to deploy ground troops in order to go after that enriched uranium. It's hard to see another way to do it without people physically on the ground. What key developments should we be looking out for that may signal that ground troops may soon be deployed?
Well, so, right, there's two different ways to deploy ground troops, right? The first is without the cooperation of the Iranians, and the other is with the cooperation of the Iranians, right? So there could be a negotiated deal where it's like, okay, together, right, the Iranians and the U.S. are going to go in together and take out the uranium, right? That could happen so that they could enter in a permissive environment. Right. The other is you got to fight your way in. And I'm not sure the administration for the uranium is willing to fight its way in. It doesn't need to at the moment, right? But it could fight and put ground troops on the islands, right, to take back the shipping oil, the main shipping oil, but also on some of the smaller islands within the Strait of Hormuz, right? It could do that. It could put some troops on key terrain along the coast, right, to keep the Iranians from using their fast boats in the strait. I think that's much more likely than sending troops in a non-permissive environment to fight their way in to take the uranium out, because, well, the uranium's buried right now and we have sight over it, so we can just kill anybody trying to go near it. But that would be very dangerous and maybe not even successful to try to do it in a non-permissive environment.
Let me ask this. The extraction of those two pilots that went down in Iran so successfully, it doesn't seem like you were surprised that we had the ability to do this, but was there anything that surprised you? The Iranians' ability to get close to where we were picking up these two troops?
No, nothing really surprised me because number one, people are like surprised that a plane got shot down. It's like, well, even if you have control of the skies, right, that doesn't mean it's 100%.
Yeah.
So that's going to happen, right? And, uh, it happened in a fairly remote area, which gave the pilot an advantage, right? And the U.S. the advantage to be able to kind of move in undetected. If it had happened and he fell into a city, that's a much different proposition at that point, right? So I think that, while it was a terrible event, it right, the circumstances around it were, biased in our favor of being able to carry it off. Again, if he had ejected and fell into the middle of Tehran, it would be a very different situation.
I want to step back quickly if I can. The president is, by default, the commander in chief. Are there certain kinds of strikes that absolutely require presidential approval, others that don't, certain types of munitions that do and don't? Take me into that world.
Yeah, so I mean that is completely and utterly up to the president of the United States, right? And so during Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson used to say that the military couldn't bomb a shithouse without, that's a quote, without his permission, right? George Bush the first, right, during the Gulf War, said, "Hey, I gave them the mission, right? They got the weapons and targets, all their decisions, right?" The Obama administration put very strong restrictions on firing rifles, on who you could fire a rifle at in Afghanistan and when you could return fire. So my understanding is that this administration has given again a wider latitude to the military to carry out the strikes needed to accomplish the missions that they've been given.
I want to end on this, and that is questions about the real people, the men and women who are in uniform. What does increased operational tempo during war mean for the people who are actually carrying out their missions?
Well, look, we have a volunteer military, and so everybody who raises their hands, all of those brave young and women, right, this is what they signed up for. And so we ought to be enormously proud of the sacrifices that they're making and putting themselves into harm's way, because nobody that's in that theater, be it on air, land, or sea, is right. It is, you worry every night and every day. What I will say is that when the force becomes stretched too thin, and you see that on some of our ships, right, and they were out 5, 6, 7, 8 months before the war started, and now they get extended. So now it's 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, right? The human mind, right? The ability to stay sharp for that long becomes difficult, right? And that's where the strain is felt by the families. It's on the extended deployments. I remember somebody, a fellow colleague, when we did the surge in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they extended tours from 12 to 15 months. They were in like month 14, and they said, hey, just so everybody knows, 15 is not 12 plus 3, right? There's a very big difference from 12 months to 15. Those 3 months are hard mentally because you're just tired, right? As the mind is tired, the body is tired, right? And so the longer this goes on, if we don't have the depth of munitions and we don't have the depth of people, right? You got to be able to rotate the people in and out the longer this goes. And so that's really, the effect is really on the long-term duration of the deployment.
And as you mentioned, not just the men and women who signed up for this heroically, but the families
The
obviously
families.
impacted. Yeah. I think maybe the last thing I want to end on, John, here is if you were personally advising policymakers today, and I know in your current capacity as non-resident scholar at the AEI, you have conversations on the back end as well. I'm sure you're giving some insight. What's the one thing that you would tell them to fix immediately?
They need to get their strategic goals correct. Because if your strategic goals are wrong, there's nothing the military can do to make the outcome right.
So
And
which goals
so,
are incorrect and which are in your mind?
well, so first, right, the goal of one short war, right? This notion that we're only going to fight short wars and they'll be of, the shock and awe, right? That's wrong, right? We need to have a force that can both do that and be a force of attrition, right? That can go for a long period of time, that has the capacity and capability to do that, right? So that's number one. And number two, like for the last 20 years, every president, the strategy has been we're getting out of the Middle East, right? Remember Obama, the pivot to the Pacific, right? Trump came in, I want to get out of the Middle East, right? Biden came in, we're getting out, and yet here we are. And so when you set a strategy that says, look, we're leaving, and then right, now all of a sudden everybody knows and they start doing things, then you keep coming back. The military is not ready because you told them we're leaving, and to cut back on the number of forces and don't build the stockpiles and the supplies. So when you plan for a short war and you plan for people to leave quickly, right, and not be there, then that's when problems occur, right? That's the macro strategy. Like you got to plan for a long duration and you got to cover all the bases.
Are there any glaring warning signs that we could see that would tell you that the system is under enhanced stress?
Well, I think you're seeing it already, right? In that, we're short munitions, right? That, like the Navy just scrapped the Boise, a submarine, because it couldn't fix it, right? The Navy's retiring more ships than it's building. The Air Force is retiring more planes than it's building, right? So, right, that's the sign that it's under stress.
Do you think other countries are facing a similar problem?
Well, what I'll say is I think the other countries are so far down beyond that, right? So the Europeans don't actually have a military. They have to rebuild. They have very, very little capacity, right? The Asian nations don't have a lot of capacity, right? The Chinese have capacity, but they've never used it. So they don't actually understand whether it works or not, right? The Russians have been grinding down their force in Ukraine, right? So in one ways, we're fighting a globe, that has disarmed in many ways. But in some ways, it makes things more dangerous than less dangerous because, right, then people assume they have a capability that they don't. The Europeans don't have much of a military left. And so that's a very dangerous situation to be in.
Last thing I have, I promise, John, and that is the ceasefire holds and say it gets extended. Your prediction of what's really going to get Iran to the table here?
So I think the thing that's got Iran back to the table is the blockade, right? So now it's a test of economic willpower, right? Who blinks first, right? The Iranians, because they have nothing coming in or going out of the country, they have no money, or the U.S. because oil prices go up and gas prices are high, right? That's the test of wills going on right now. And so that's where we are at the moment, is who can withstand the economic pain the most. Now, what'll happen is at some point somebody's going to blink on the economic pain and they're going to try to inflict pain in a different way. And that's when wars spiral. So we're like, okay, get it right, we're just going to keep bombing you. And the Iranians may go, well, we're going to hit the desalination plants in the Middle East, right? Or hey, we're going to cause problems and terrorism acts in the United States, right? So, right, you never know how this thing's going to spill out.
Well, we'll leave it on an unknown, and an unknown is surely a reality here. So, John Ferrari, I appreciate your insight and your expertise and your time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with John. I think he has a lot of key insight over his decades of experience within the Pentagon of how America readies herself before war, during war, whether he thinks any country has the ability to fight short wars versus long wars. So with that, I'm going to close this conversation, and I appreciate you joining another edition of Byline with Ben Dennis. More social clips are going to be posted online. I hope to have a conversation there. Drop your comments, drop your questions for me, and your suggestions of who we want to patch in from my perspective on the couch and wherever they are in the world to go behind the headlines and really explain why they matter. Take it easy.